Hello, everybody. We welcome you to this Crest Academy webinar. Dr. Terry Young and I will be hosting it today. And I'm Dan Reinhardt, the president of Crest Leadership, and glad to be able to have with me my partner and worker together in Crest, Dr. Young.
And I'm Terry Young, and I've been working with Crest for a number of years and work with the MCL certificate that we offer after people have concluded the diploma certificate program. And great to be with you today.
Yeah, MCL stands for the Master in Christian Leadership.
Yeah.
So Terry, tell folks, what are we going to get today?
Well, this brief webinar is simply going to be an introduction to the nature of organizational trauma that we have all experienced. It comes in many, many shapes and sizes. We're going to talk about 4 of the realities of what happens in the midst of trauma and crisis. And then we're also going to take a little bit of a look at one particular very well-known organizational trauma, which is the Columbine incident a number of years ago. Then we're going to look at 4 resources that can greatly help you in dealing with organizational trauma and navigating through, and then conclude with what I trust is a more beautiful question in this time that we're in.
We've had people saying, boy, this is a really good webinar I want to get on. So let's dive into it, Terry.
Good. Thank you, Dan. As we move into this area of organizational trauma, what we're dealing with is the simple matter and profound matter of how organizations, teams, congregations can at times get hurt. Sometimes they're hurt by things internally, but sometimes they're hurt and traumatized by things that are external. And so the whole field of organizational trauma is a fascinating area of what happens when living things get hurt. We have a deep dive that we have developed on this that'll be in the Crest Academy, and we'll provide you some other perspective and resources to be thinking through how you on your team or your congregation can make their way in a wise way and hopefully in a healing way through times of trauma. Now, the stories that we tell to ourselves and to one another are of multiplicity of kind of stories. What I've done here on this particular screen is simply place there that you can have stories of family business drama. You can have stories of colleagues within your organization who have disappeared. You can have church fights. You can have the trauma of the church burning down. There can be the trauma of someone who engages in financial boundary violation. I've put there the little square of Barry Madoff, sort of a takeoff on Bernie Madoff, sadly passed away recently. But I've always said if you have a financial advisor whose last name is Madoff and you're giving him your money, you probably should not give him your money.
In the first place.
Yeah, the first thing you should do is not maybe think twice about that. I'm going to get to COVID-19 in a moment, but there's also sometimes church messes that develop. I had one leader tell me a story of a little brush fire that started in his congregation over a relationship between a couple people in his church. And it was for a while just a little bit of a grass fire. But as he looked back, he realized that they didn't tend to it, and some winds blew up, and it began to spread to all kinds of other people in the congregation. I've had leaders tell stories of churches that have dealt with staff members who've had a stalker, and that trauma of having a stalker going after one of the staff members, and how that affected the entire congregation in time because people took sides as to how that person should be treated.
Wow.
The mutiny of the staffer sometimes, and some pastors can tell stories of having a staff member who sort of gets into a little bit of a mutiny related to your leadership, and how that may start in a way that's sort of hidden away, but it begins to spread to other leaders and other dimensions of the congregation. You have exposure of major leaders, and we've talked about this in previous Crest webinars, is that major leaders that are globally known fall, they fail. And there are global shockwaves from that, and even the local congregation is impacted by that trauma.
Yep.
Then there's other ones. I've listed there, and these are things that happen in organizations, profit, for-profit, nonprofit, medical institutions, education. There are things that happen that hurt the organization. Sometimes they're economic. Someone does run off with money. Sometimes they are sexual boundary violations. Sometimes they're authority boundary violations. And those are things that are internal and have to do with people who work within the organization, who do things that hurt the congregation, hurt the organization, hurt the business. There are also external threats. So there are external traumas that come, and this is where we get into storm moments that have to do with with actual perhaps forest fires or tornadoes or hurricanes that sweep through an entire region, or as we're going to see in a moment, the earthquake metaphor. These are things that are in nature. They are natural disasters. So we have human-caused hurt, injury, trauma. We also have nature-caused injury, hurt, or trauma. And when these things come and they hit a group of people, people are hurt. They're traumatized. Now, COVID-19, this year of COVID-19, we're now a year plus from the beginning of the just sort of rolling out measures to try to somehow deal with what has been framed a global pandemic. And many congregations, many businesses have found themselves seeking to react, respond, adapt, pivot, and they've been in a year of never-ending adaptation. And in a sense, it has affected the life of congregations, the life of businesses. The people who live within those environments have been impacted. I put the phrase there, this involves the loss of our assumptive world. So who would have thought a year and a month ago that the assumption that we have that we will be ever able to gather the way we have gathered for decades or hundreds of years within our congregations, that would ever have a severe limitation. So it's an assumption that we have realized has been lost. That assumption isn't a false assumption. It's simply an assumption based upon previous experience. And then COVID comes along and that assumptive world gets shaken. This puts people into crisis.
Yeah, and that's huge. That we can't meet with our own family members in our own home. That's incredible. And that not only shakes us personally, so we're going through our own personal trauma of trying to figure this one out, but when entire groups can't meet, like you can't meet to worship.
Right.
And if you do, you're not allowed to sing. But grief, who would ever have thought of that? And that really has shaken us. And then if you in your business, you can't have people come in your store, only a few people. Certain stores, they can have everybody they want, but yours can't. Like, boy, these are really shaking us.
And within congregations, you have pastors and pastoral leadership and boards, governing boards who are seeking to navigate with a congregation that is impacted by this, but not just impacted by it, but their particular perspective, their ideas, their opinions, their convictions about all the things that are attached to this get then woven into the fabric of trying to keep a community together when people disagree.
Oh man, yeah. We've heard from some of our Crest students that within their group, their organization, there are some who say we shouldn't be submitting to any of these restrictions, and others say, oh, we got to abide by everything. And boy, do the leaders feel the tension between those two pulling on them. Wow.
I recently heard someone talking about the tension between Paul and Romans 13 about the role of governing authorities and the Matthew 25 word of Jesus that we are to care for one another and be present with those who are hungry and thirsty, right, and be in their space, loving them. Yeah. And so which is it? So we're in a time where people are under the stress of this. They bring that stress with them wherever they go. And then leaders find themselves having to then lead with traumatized families, teams, organizations, congregations. So that leads to a higher level of burden that leaders need to carry. In the deep dive, I use a number of metaphors related to what I call storm moments. All the things in these little boxes here are storms. Some of them are windstorms that blow through your congregation organization. They're like the windstorm we had here a couple nights ago, and some streets got closed, some wires went down, some power went out, and a couple days you clean up and you move on. Some storm moments are more severe. Hurricanes, they tend to devastate a landscape, but even there it can be very hit and miss. One of the metaphors that I use is this metaphor of seismic events or earthquakes. So earthquakes have their own, there's a nature attached to an earthquake in which there is a seismic event. It is often very deep under the surface. It has an epicenter, but it acts very strangely because if there is a shaking near the epicenter, the largest shaking is near the epicenter, but there can be shaking way out and indiscriminate. It can be in all kinds of different places at different intensities. Then there's aftershocks, and the aftershocks can occur hours, days, and even weeks afterwards. In an earthquake environment, there is damage that occurs with the original event. You then seek to address the event. And as people address the event, an aftershock occurs. And that puts people at risk. It can hurt people.
Yeah, no, isn't that the challenge here? We think, okay, I put out a lot of effort and we can address the challenge. And we thought we were done. And then a week later or 2 weeks or a month later, boom, another thing hits. And it becomes one after another that it exhausts the leaders.
Yeah, that's the greatest challenge is the weariness factor of leaders and the people they lead, those they lead with, because we just want the ground to settle. We want the earth to go back to just a calm kind of equilibrium.
Yeah.
And this metaphor can apply to, the scenario of the little fire. You have a congregation that has a conflict, or WWE visits your church and you've got two people who are fighting, and the grass fire becomes a bigger conflagration. You apply water appropriately, you sit down with the people, you seek to build some reconciliation, and then a couple of weeks later something pops up again that someone's not going to let go of this because they think you didn't deal with it properly.
Yeah.
and so every traumatizing season can have this kind of seismic dimension to it. So there are four realities in organizational trauma that I just want to touch on. Reality number one is that trauma, by its very nature, leads to a loss of some control. So we have our brains are wired in such a way that we have mental maps of how we navigate our world. And those maps of how we navigate our world related to church life is that our mental map for navigating the world is that this is what church looks like. We have a congregation of people who gather, they worship, they praise God, they gather to be equipped to serve one another, to serve the world. And our mental model is very clear. That's how the world works.
Mm-hmm.
When trauma occurs like COVID, there's a loss of control of that mental model because that mental model no longer really applies. We have to adapt and think, well, we can't do what we've done just by natural kind of behavior. We can't do that anymore.
Right.
And so there's a loss of control.
Yeah. And also things are unpredictable. So you can't plan that this is going to be in the future because it might not be allowed. And
right.
So if there's no predictability, it's very difficult to plan.
Yeah. Yep. And most of us don't do well with unpredictability. We really do like certainty.
Yeah.
In the midst of a lack of certainty, we tend to think, well, we need to give people certainty. Well, you can't give people certainty. What you need to do is give people clarity about who you are and what you're about.
Yeah.
That's what you can do. The second reality in organizational trauma is this issue that trauma triggers for almost all of us. It triggers for us the brain impulses to early on catastrophize.
Yeah.
So that's a natural experience for most of us. And we've all discovered that for some people, that early triggering of catastrophizing is small and it settles out. But for other people, it doesn't settle out.
Especially if it goes on and on.
Right.
Then they feel like, see, that's
Yep.
true. See, the world is coming to an end. We are about done here, and it's going to
Yep.
be disaster. And they start fantasizing about the horrendous experience of everything collapsing.
Yeah. And most of us have been surprised of the wide band of perspective on this, that we still have people who are very, very fearful. They are scared. They are traumatized, and they continue to be traumatized by this, by the pandemic, by the virus. And this is where one of the things that we need to encourage ourselves to do and others to do is to get above it. That is to get perspective and seek to be in community with others who can help you somewhat turn down that emotional, catastrophic kind of thinking and feeling. So that's the second thing. The third thing is that trauma by its very nature jostles and impacts our normal connections with people.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't matter what the trauma is, it affects relationship. Now in COVID, it has had a direct bearing on relationship, just simply on the issue of relating, of getting together.
Yes.
But layered into the way we're all responding differently, that's added another dimension to what is being lost by way of normal connection. There are some families that we know of and you know of who have been divided severely by this. So in the midst of just simply trying to navigate through this year, you've got the added burden of being on the outs with brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, grandparents, parents, kids. You've got kids who are thinking very differently about this than parents. And it goes both ways. And so another reality is that it jostles connection. It jostles relationships. And the fourth reality is that it potentially can annihilate structures and routines. So the way we've normally operated, by way of our structures, by way of our process, by the way of the way we do things, those things get jostled, they get affected. Sometimes those structures get annihilated. And routines also, as many of you have felt, you had to really think through in those first early months, okay, I need to somehow get a hold of my routines because my routines are all off kilter.
Yeah, we don't go to the office anymore. So
right.
What do? You stay home, you just had breakfast, and okay, now what do I do? It's fascinating how just the rhythm of going to an office and having a coffee break and having a lunch and then ending at 5 or 6, whatever, just that structure alone, when that's removed, can put us into a now what do I do? And now we have no regular rhythm to our life.
Right. Yep.
Boy.
So these are 4 realities. So that's why we have all felt like prior to March of 2020, we were on some paths that were relatively predictable, relatively, they were well known, well traveled. We knew where we were headed, where we were going, and then 2020 hits, and we find ourselves in this tangled mess now of trying to figure out, okay, what is our way forward? And these are things that are just part of trauma. They're part of this can be applied right down to the personal level. Is that when you go through a personal trauma, and some trauma or injury comes to you, you're a living thing, and you get hurt. Think about the fact that you've had some elements of control taken from you. You've had your mind immediately catastrophize about what now, what if, what's going to be next. You realize that in the trauma, you're relating differently to people in your world. You're also finding that your routines have gone out the window. So that applies personally. It also applies organizationally.
Mhm.
And that's why we as leaders need to be aware of, okay, what's going on, not only with the wider world that I lead in, but what's going on with me. So in CREST, we talk about paying attention to your own functioning as a part of leadership. So that's where self-leadership, self-awareness is a key element of good leadership and wise leadership. So we're always tending what's going on around me, but what's going on with me? And how am I learning, and how am I going to, hopefully in a positive way, model some things in the midst of this craziness, because trauma introduces craziness. And what am I going to do to strengthen my own leadership in the midst of it? So I want to share with you some thoughts about a well-known organizational tragedy, which is Columbine. It's many years ago now. I have a colleague who a number of years ago did some actually PhD research on the matter of when trauma visits schools by way of school shootings. So this is one that is well known to many people. This is the Columbine Memorial that is set up in the southern suburb of Denver area, Columbine. And my friend who did research on this made some comments about the lessons that we learn from Columbine and other places that have gone through great trauma. So I'm just going to quickly just summarize these for you. And I think you'll resonate with some of these things. Number one is that when things like this happen, the sense of what is possible changes as a result of one of these major crises. So before these kind of things happen, we really can't imagine that that would be possible. A COVID-19 year has been an introduction to all of us as to a much wider sense of what is possible as a result of a major global crisis.
Yeah, nobody nobody would have anticipated that we would have directives that you're not allowed to meet with your own family, grandkids in your home.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah.
Who would ever have thought of that?
Yeah. So this is, in a sense, one of the things that, if you could call it, it is one benefit, if you could call it that, of crisis and trauma, is that it expands our thinking about the need to think about what we think right now is not possible, to think about those things.
Hmm.
This is one of the things about crisis readiness and preparedness, is that we'll touch on it later near the end, that we're often unprepared for crisis because we think, well, none of these things will ever really hit us. And actually, wise organizations take time to think through some of these things that could happen.
Yeah.
Ian Mitroff says, act like a saint, but you need to figure out how to think like a sociopath. So it isn't a bad thing to think like a sociopath from time to time with your team, to think about what would be the worst case scenario that could happen on our campus.
But is that catastrophizing?
No, it isn't. No, that's actually just placing before your team. Let's think about, what would we do if this week our church burned down?
Yeah. Okay.
What do we do?
Yeah.
Let's talk about that. What would we do if we had a call from social services that a member of our volunteer team is being investigated for their involvement with a child?
Mm. Yeah.
What would we do? Have we even thought about what we do? The exercise itself is a lowering of the emotion related to these things, and allows your team to think through, okay, we acknowledge we're not ready at all.
Yeah.
We'd better think about some ways to be ready.
Well, and it's easier to think about that, that call when it's not actually happened yet.
Yes.
The emotions aren't near as high.
Yeah.
So you can think a little more rationally, because when emotions get high, we think in fight or flight.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the old adage that, the time to dig a well is before the drought.
Yeah, right.
uh, the
Good.
way the way to best prepare for trauma and crisis is before the crisis.
Yeah.
Because if we haven't thought about any of this, then the crisis hits. And
Yeah.
what are we doing? We're reacting in the
And
moment. We're scrambling.
yeah.
And in the scramble, often our reaction makes things worse.
Yeah. We don't make good decisions when
Right.
we're panicking.
Yeah. Yeah. So the sense of what's possible changes. Secondly, times of trauma involve a radical shift in leadership tasks. So with COVID, many pastors and leaders of organizations and people who own their businesses would say they found in those early weeks their leadership tasks shifted dramatically because all the things they maybe had on their plan list, their to-do list, their sort of long-term strategy list, all those things had to be somewhat put aside.
Yep.
And they had to deal with what was in front of them. And some leaders have thought, well, I can still do what's all of this and then deal with what's in front of me.
You can't.
You actually have to sort of say, no,
Yeah.
right now, the most important thing is what's important now.
Yeah.
So that's the second one. The third one is it refers to emotion work. So he said emotion work becomes a major part of the work in navigating through trauma and the aftermath of a trauma. Now, emotion work has to do with how we as leaders know that there is a level at which we evoke certain emotions, and we also suppress other emotions.
Mm.
So as leaders, there's an added burden because what do leaders sense in the midst of the crisis, the trauma, the unfolding, is they have to maintain a measure of calmness. They have to maintain a measure of maybe positivity, encouragement. And so they're evoking certain things. That's called surface acting. It's part of emotion work.
Yep.
They also have to do deep acting. And that is they have to suppress certain emotions. Now, the research on emotion work tells us that this is very, very exhausting to do this long term. So some of you who are on this webinar will be able to, I trust, get some insight here as to why you're so tired. It's because you've been carrying and holding your environment, your congregation, your team, your business, your organization, and you have been doing emotional work. It actually becomes very wearying and very tiring. And that's why we need safe places and havens where we can let down and we can truly express what is really deep down inside of us. By way of fear, by way of sadness, by way of anger, by way of frustration, because otherwise we're keeping all of that kind of damped down. We're sort of keeping all those tennis balls under the water. And that's why our arms are so tired. Yep. Because we're just simply keeping things, because we feel the role of leadership is to show a positive face and to be the smiley one in the midst of all this.
Yeah.
And that's taxing.
Oh, yeah.
My friend who did research on school shootings talked to administrators, principals, and they said this was one of the most difficult things is because they said in hindsight, I was very, very reticent to show what I was really feeling because I wanted to be strong for everyone.
So should they tell people what they're feeling, or do they need to be strong in the midst of that time?
A number of them in my friend's research indicated that they discovered that in the public presence presentation, they really felt in hindsight that was important to show that calmness. And a number said what really saved me was that secure, safe environment with others, with peers, family members, counselor, where I was able to let down. I was able to let out fully what it was I was experiencing.
I can imagine that if people see their leader panicking, that doesn't help their panic at all.
No. Yeah.
So there is a bit of self-management here that even though you don't know exactly, there needs to be a sense that, I am as the leader, I'm thinking above the fray.
Yeah.
Where, you've always encouraged us to have this balcony view. that there's a bigger picture here than just this crisis,
Right.
and to be confident about that bigger picture
Yeah.
that's an important role, I think, for people who
Yep.
feel the urgency of this crisis right here.
Yeah. Yeah. Fourth related one is wearing the mantle of leadership is centralized as a definition of leadership.
Mm.
Those who were interviewed by my friend said they felt an added kind of importance to making sure that they were present like never before. They were strong like never before. They were there for parents. They were there for students. They were there for colleagues. They were there. And so the mantle becomes centralized. This is what leaders do.
Mm-hmm.
Leaders hold the environment. They're expected to hold the environment. And that holding work is what's central. Nothing more important.
Yeah. That's emotional.
Yep. The final one is that leaders, and this was his conclusion, leaders always pay a high personal toll as a result of trauma.
Yeah.
And this is an acknowledgement, an honest acknowledgement on the part of any of you who are leading a team, an organization, you're leading a business or you're leading a congregation, to have some patience and mercy with yourself because of what you're sensing and what you're feeling, because it does take a toll. And this is why you need resources that can help you in this. And one of them is self-care. My colleague asked principals and administrators, what did you do to care for yourself? A number of them said, I didn't think about that. And they were the ones who said, you need to know, this has basically ended my marriage.
Wow.
This has destroyed my family.
Mm.
There were others who said, when they were asked, how did you care for yourself? Said, I didn't do a very good job in the early weeks of the aftermath of Columbine, but I soon woke up and realized I had better take care of myself. Otherwise, there'll be nothing left of me to take care of anyone else. And that's that element of knowing it takes a toll. You need to be aware of that and add resources, manage well the load that you're carrying, and find the support and confidence and sanctuary that you need in the midst of it. Otherwise, if you're out there wearing this mantle of leadership and thinking you need to be 24/7, the person who is there for people, it's only a matter of time before that takes you down. So related to these type of things, there's a question we ask, and I think a number of people have been asking this in this year. Were we prepared for anything like this? And I remember probably 10 years ago, there was material that came out for churches on the pandemic. And the language that was used was, folks, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And there was a brief kind of period where, for whatever reason, this material was floating through and before our eyes. And we took a bit of time to look through it. But there again, it's like, well, that's highly unlikely.
Mm-hmm.
So interesting information, but very few organizations really developed a pandemic plan. Except the fellow who ran Intel for a number of years, his name just slips me, ran Intel. Intel developed about 10 or 15 years ago a pandemic team. And it's been in place for years. And they were prepared.
Wow.
Because they realized some of these things are things that can occur. Now, saying that, does that mean you should shape a pandemic team for the next one? It may not be a pandemic team, but I think it's advisable and wise for organizations to think about a task team. The term that is now used is every organization needs a red team of 2 or 3 people who go to school on all of this, and they do the reading, they do the research, they do the kind of background development of what does it mean to be crisis ready, what does it mean to be crisis prone, what does it mean to be crisis prepared. And they're the ones who actually do some scenario planning with teams from time to time to
Mhm.
say, we're going to take you through an exercise and we're going to go through it in the deep dive. One of the resources we've given you in the deep dive is we gave you there's some handouts there in the Academy. It's going to be loaded there for you. There's a table of major crisis types or risks for all organizations. And what this does is it gives you major lessons that have been learned about crisis preparedness and what are the types of crisis that you could experience. So there are economic crises, there are informational crises, there are physical crises like the loss of your facility. There's human resource crises. There's reputational crises. There's psychopathic crises. There's natural disaster crises. And one of the things that Ian Mitroff, who's probably the granddaddy of the global leader in crisis preparedness, says that the wise organization plans for at least one crisis in each crisis family.
Oh, wow.
Actually does the kind of thinking, what would we do? And you think through what is your crisis response plan. So a red team is like a crisis response team. That would be a very wise thing to do because that is moving you from unprepared to at least somewhat more prepared.
So, and this becomes more urgent the larger your organization.
Right.
Because the larger your organization, the more exposed you are, the more likely something is going wrong.
Yes.
Going to go wrong somewhere. So we're not advocating here that, you know, every little business or every little country church should have this scenario.
No.
But if you are leading a large organization, you better do this. And I took some training once on this a few years ago, and they pointed out that you need to have an identified team.
Yes.
When something happens, everybody knows that team's going to take care of it. And that team meets. And one of the things that was crucial about that team was that they had one spokesman. Especially if you're a large organization, the media might call, and that's disaster if the wrong person talks to them.
Right.
So you have to designate the one person that is trained and ready to handle this. And you always defer to that person that they know how to handle the media kind of thing.
Right.
So that's what a red team looks like, is that when there's a red alert, they're in charge. It means the normal board stuff and the normal committee stuff doesn't work on this. It all defers to the red team.
Yep.
That's really good advice there, Terry.
Yep. So if there was one thing that comes out of this, it would be, this may prompt you to simply think more deeply with a few of your leaders about this. Whether it's a red team or a crisis response team or a crisis event team, is to think through how could we be better prepared for the possibility of one of these things happening. And you actually need to think in the psychopathic kind of crisis area, you need to think like a psychopath.
It's hard to do.
This sort of hit me. I was at a conference a few years ago, and I was at a table with a couple, and we introduced ourselves. Later in the day, they got up on the stage. It was not a large conference, but they got up on the stage, and they were from a town in Texas. They were the pastor and wife of the church where that man went in and was engaged in a shooting incident at his church.
Wow.
14 people were killed.
Oof.
His daughter was killed.
Oh.
He told the story. He said the night before, he and his wife were not there. They were out of town. The night before, he was at an event in another city. He was having dinner with some friends. And strangely, the topic came up. What would you do with an active shooter event in your church?
Mm.
And this fellow said, well, we would never have a problem with that because we're in Texas. And I have any number of people in my congregation who have carry permits, and they carry.
Hmm.
So if anyone dared to do that, it would be short-lived. The person would not last very long.
Hmm.
He gets a call the next Sunday morning of a shooter event in his church, 14 people killed. He said not one person was there that weekend who was a carry person, had a gun with them.
Yeah. So there was an assumption that he had.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yep.
yeah, we got lots of people who will carry,
Yep.
so we'll be fine.
Yep. So at that conference, they asked the question, how many of you are prepared for any kind of event in your church on the weekend of someone who comes in, and whether they have a gun or whether they are simply, accosting people, abuse or fighting people or whatever, are you prepared?
Hmm.
And probably 80% of the people gathered there said, no, we have no sense of how we would respond. We would react. And then they shared stories of churches that have reacted
And it probably
and
didn't.
how terrible it turned out.
Yep.
So this matter of prepared or unprepared. Look, the final piece we want to share with you, and there's so much more, and we'll develop in the days ahead the things that can fill this in, but some resources for leading in times of organizational trauma. One is simply remind yourself of how human systems work. Human systems are ever this equation of resources and load and margin. If you have more resources than load, you have positive margin. If you've got more load than you have resources, then you're going to be a negative margin. That's what's going to create the weariness, the tiredness. And so this equation is ever at play. And when something like COVID occurs, you need to realize this is placing upon you and the people you lead more load. So the resources you have aren't unlimited. You need to realize you have time, energy, people. You need to apply those resources to the new load that is upon you. So you can't, you need to set aside some things. You need to prioritize and really get focused on what is most important now.
Yeah. So lighten the load means taking some things off the plate or
Yes.
some things off the organization to say, we're just going to pause on that for a while. And it might mean budget change too, because you
Right.
can actually put that kind of resource toward things. So the flexibility to be able to say, we don't have to keep doing everything like we always used to do. Let's lighten the load. Let's just give
Yeah.
some space. Very
Yep.
good. That's a good idea.
And some of that involves not being afraid to be tough-minded about those things.
Mhm.
You want to be tough-minded and tender-minded. So tender-minded related to people, but tough-minded related to your structures, processes, things you do, and decisions need to be made, because you only have really two options. You can increase resources. That'll help, but where are you going to find resources? More resources when money has gotten scarcer.
Yeah.
When people already are limited. Or you can decrease load. So that involves getting tough-minded with some things to say, what's important now is we care well for our people, care well for our organization, and do the central work that is what we're about. Other than that, everything extra needs to wait. So this is how living systems work, because you don't want to get in negative margin and be in negative margin, because you'll collapse.
And Terry, I'm thinking also that the role of the primary leader is to care for your secondary leaders.
Yes.
Don't
Yep.
try to care for everybody.
Yep.
Care for the leaders that are going to care for everybody.
Yep.
So you put your attention to your team.
The second one is leader self-care. We talk about this a great deal in Crest. And leader self-care is simply the practice of get on your balcony, take time for reflection, take time for rest and replenishment, take time to also read your gauges. And this needs to be a regular kind of thing. As to how am I physically, emotionally, spiritually, emotionally, and intellectually? Am I attending well to my own self-care? And the gauges that are there, and you've got gauges that go down, tend to those gauges, and they're all intertwined. Also, for leader self-care, to think about healthy boundaries. And this is one of the things in crisis that is very difficult for leaders, the issue of saying no, the issue of disconnecting, the issue of going offline. But you have to do that. And this is where the third element, and we're thinking this one here is not one that we really understand very well. Build leadership density involves helping people within your organizational culture understand that everyone has influence. Everyone can exercise what are called leadership behaviors. That is, care for one another. Focus on the task that's before you. And so building leadership density is what increases resources. If we have organizations where everything rises or falls on the leader, you have very scarce leadership density. And that is a recipe for leadership disaster, burnout, very quickly. So this is sharing the load, building out leadership density, helping people understand a different model of leadership. It's not about power. It's not about status. It's not about title. People throughout an organization exercise influence. Some have authority, some don't have authority. And so those without authority need to realize they have a role to play as well. And then finally, you simply create an organizational culture that nourishes all of these resources. So this could be something that we may build out at a future point. The deep dive itself is really more designed to help you get a handle on the very nature of organizational trauma and some of the things that we need to be very aware of. This is a deeper, another piece here. Let me close, Dan, with just a few things here. The nature of living systems when trauma strikes. To realize there are three possibilities. It is possible that a system can be destroyed. It can close its doors. Or the system can survive, but it becomes weakened. That is, there's damage that is done. There are things that are affected, and the system continues on, but it's never the same. It's just it's hobbling. There's no real recuperation. There's no real kind of restoration or therapy that is done to help the system get back to strength. The third possibility, and that's the thing we hope for, is the system over time is strengthened. This is the new field of study in post-traumatic growth. It's not a default position that when we go through trauma, we have post-traumatic stress disorder.
No.
We don't need to go, there is growth that is possible. So there is a PSG that is being post-traumatic growth research that's being done. And that is where people make a decision to do the work that's needed to, over time, be stronger. So here's the more beautiful question. It's a book by an author a number of years ago, A More Beautiful Question. And he doesn't deal with this question, but here's one that we can think about in our Christian organization or congregation. How can we become stronger as a result of this adversity or trauma? This is a question to put into the midst of your team, your staff team, your organizational team, your board, and to camp on this and really ask the question in a deep way. How could we become stronger as a result of this?
I would say going through stress will reveal parts that are weak and parts that are strong. You become aware of that. Before crisis, before trauma, we probably weren't aware of those things. So we become more consciously aware of ourselves personally and our organization. And if we process that in a good way, I think you're right, Terry. We can actually become stronger coming through trauma.
Every crisis is a revealer. So pay attention to what it reveals about you, about your team, about your organization in its present state. And then don't go into a pity party about that. Face it. Yeah. I often say to some of my students, you need to learn how to turn bad days into good data. Well, if you've had a bad response to trauma, turn that bad response to trauma into good data, good information, good learning.
Yes.
The other thing about crisis that we learn is that crisis reveals fundamentally who we are, only more so. So that's humbling, because that causes you to think, how am I responding to this? What does that tell me about my own relative resilience and hardiness? Maybe I've got some work to do. We've got some work to do. So do the work. And that's how you can become stronger.
Yeah, that's good. That's very good. So I was thinking I should help people just see where they can go to get this deep dive you've been talking about, because you go into more detail in the deep dive here. So let me just share my screen and show folks how you can find this. So we'll look right here. So just go to the crestleadership.ca. That's our website right there. And here's our homepage. And you can see that we're all about helping leaders flourish. There's some questions about midlife here. And here's the diploma program if you would like to have an ongoing journey with us. We also then have the master's degree, the MCL that Terry mentioned there. You keep scrolling down, you come to the Crest Academy. And this is where we have the webinars that we're talking about. Here's the one today. And then in the Academy, we also have the courses. So here's the courses. And you can actually go right here to the deep dive courses and see it directly, each course that's here. And here we're talking about this one here, Growing Through Organizational Trauma. So if you click right here, you can see the course information, and you'll see an outline here of what's in this particular course. So we want to encourage you folks, if you're serious about wanting to do something about being organizationally prepared, you can just come, and we will encourage you to get the deep dive here. Along with this webinar that you've just had, you will have the very beginnings of a good handle on what you can do to actually grow through trauma. And that would be the ultimate test of a leader, helping your whole organization and all your people to actually grow through the crises that come to their life. So, Terry, it's been good to have this conversation with you and to benefit from your good research on this. And I'm hoping that our leaders and our listeners can really benefit from this as well.
Good. Thank you, Dan. Been great to be with all of you. I trust you benefit and are blessed by this.